The White House stands at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue as perhaps the most recognizable address in the world. Its neoclassical facade, illuminated against the Washington night sky, projects an image of stability, authority, and democratic ideals. Yet behind its pristine columns and manicured gardens lies a far more complex and often darker narrative. This is a story not of the official tours and state dinners, but of the hidden corridors of power, the personal sacrifices, the moral compromises, and the profound toll that the presidency exacts from those who occupy the Oval Office. Welcome to The Secret History of the White House, The Price of Power. For more than 2 centuries, this building has been the stage upon which American democracy performs its most critical acts, where the fate of millions is decided, where wars are declared and peace is negotiated, where the machinery of government grinds forward or grinds to a halt. But what we see from the outside, the carefully choreographed press conferences and state ceremonies, represents only a fraction of the reality that unfolds within these walls. When construction began in 1792, the White House was designed to be a symbol. Architect James Hoban drew inspiration from European palaces, yet created something distinctly American. The building would house not a monarch, but an elected leader. This fundamental tension between democratic ideals and concentrated power would echo through every subsequent administration. George Washington never lived in the White House, but his influence shaped it. He understood that the presidency required gravitas, a physical manifestation of authority that could compete with the courts of Europe. Yet he also recognized the danger. Power, Washington knew from watching the French Revolution unfold, could corrupt absolutely. His voluntary relinquishment of the presidency after 2 terms established a precedent that would hold for nearly a century and a half, a recognition that the office itself demanded sacrifice, including the sacrifice of power. Washington's decision to walk away from power when he could have held it for life stands as one of the most remarkable acts in political history, a conscious choice to place principle above personal ambition. John Adams became the first president to occupy the still unfinished mansion in November 1800. His wife Abigail famously hung her laundry in the East Room. This domestic detail reveals something essential about the early White House. It was simultaneously the seat of executive power and a family home. This duality would create profound challenges for every family that followed. Adams himself felt the weight of living in what he called this great castle, writing to Abigail before she arrived that he prayed heaven would bestow the best of blessings on the house and all who would inhabit it. He could not have known the trials that would unfold within those walls, the personal tragedies and political crises that would test every future occupant. What the public rarely sees are the spaces where true power operates. The Situation Room, established by John F. Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs disaster, sits in the basement of the West Wing. In this windowless chamber, presidents have ordered military strikes, negotiated with terrorists, and monitored operations that could trigger nuclear war. The walls are designed to prevent electronic eavesdropping. The atmosphere is deliberately austere. Here, away from the grand reception rooms and historical portraits, the weight of command becomes tangible. The Oval Office itself underwent numerous renovations, each president leaving their mark. But more significant than the decor are the psychological transformations that occur within those walls. Former staffers describe a palpable shift when someone crosses the threshold. Visitors become supplicants, advisors choose their words more carefully. The office confers authority, but also isolation. Harry Truman famously kept a sign on his desk reading, "The buck stops here." This wasn't merely a folksy aphorism, it was a statement of the crushing responsibility that defines the presidency. Truman understood better than most the weight of presidential decisions. His choice to use atomic weapons against Japan haunted him for the rest of his life, though he maintained publicly that he never lost sleep over it. This discrepancy between public statements and private anguish would become a recurring pattern for presidents facing impossible choices. The residence floors, where the first family actually lives, tell another story. These private quarters have witnessed marriages strain under the pressure of public scrutiny. Children grow up surrounded by Secret Service agents, and presidents face their darkest moments alone. Eleanor Roosevelt once described the White House as the loneliest place in the world. She wasn't speaking of physical isolation, but of the psychological burden of living in a building where every room carries historical weight and every decision faces historical judgment. The Lincoln bedroom, named for the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, serves as a constant reminder of the moral weight that presidents must carry. Lincoln himself never slept in that room, but his presence haunts it nonetheless. He spent countless nights pacing the halls, unable to sleep as the Civil War raged and casualties mounted. His depression was well known to his contemporaries, though largely hidden from the broader public. The burden of preserving the Union while hundreds of thousands died weighed on him physically and mentally. Photographs from the beginning and end of his presidency show a man aged decades in just 4 years. The lines in his face deepened, his eyes grew more hollow, his frame more gaunt. This physical manifestation of the presidency's toll would be repeated in nearly every administration that followed. The price of presidential power extends far beyond the individual who takes the oath of office. Presidential families become public property, their lives dissected, their mistakes magnified, their privacy obliterated. This has been true from the beginning, but the advent of mass media transformed surveillance into something far more intrusive. Consider the Kennedy family. John F. Kennedy's extramarital affairs remained largely hidden from the public during his lifetime, protected by a more deferential press corps. Yet the personal toll on Jackie Kennedy was immense. She maintained an impeccable public image while privately enduring humiliation. After the president's assassination, she told historian Theodore White that she wanted people to remember the Kennedy administration as Camelot. This carefully constructed mythology served to preserve her husband's legacy, but it also trapped her in a performance that demanded she sublimate her own pain to historical narrative. Jackie Kennedy spent the rest of her life trying to escape the shadow of those 1,000 days, remarrying and moving to New York, seeking a private life that would never truly be hers again. The Nixon family offers a darker example. Richard Nixon's obsession with power and his paranoia about enemies eventually consumed not just his presidency, but his family's dignity. His daughters, Tricia and Julie, watched their father's public disgrace unfold in real time. Julie Nixon Eisenhower later described the final days of the Nixon presidency as a kind of death watch, with the family helpless to prevent the inevitable collapse. Pat Nixon, who had been a reluctant political spouse from the beginning, suffered a stroke shortly after they left Washington. The stress of Watergate had exacted a physical toll. She had stood by her husband through decades of political battles, enduring his absences, his obsessions, his need for vindication, and in the end, she paid the price for his choices. Presidential children face unique pressures that no amount of Secret Service protection can shield them from. Amy Carter, daughter of Jimmy Carter, attended public school in Washington, an attempt at normalcy that instead exposed her to intense media scrutiny at age 9. She was photographed constantly, her every move documented, her childhood stolen by the demands of her father's office. Chelsea Clinton grew up during her father's impeachment, forced to defend her family against salacious headlines while navigating her teenage years. The humiliation of having her father's sexual behavior discussed in graphic detail in news reports around the world created a trauma that she has rarely discussed publicly. Malia and Sasha Obama navigated adolescence under the watch of not just Secret Service protection, but the social media age. Every teenage mistake or rebellion became impossible because any misstep would reflect on their father's presidency. They were expected to be perfect representatives of their race, their generation, and their father's values, an impossible burden for anyone, let alone children and teenagers. The role of First Lady has evolved dramatically, but the personal cost remains steep. Lady Bird Johnson suffered from depression during much of her husband's presidency, exhausted by the demands of public performance while privately worrying about Lyndon Johnson's health and the toll Vietnam was taking on him. She threw herself into beautification projects and education initiatives partly as a way to create her own identity separate from her husband's increasingly unpopular war. Rosalind Carter described feeling like she was in a cocoon in the White House, cut off from real life. She had been an active partner in her husband's political career, attending cabinet meetings and serving as a trusted advisor, but the intensity of scrutiny made her feel imprisoned. Nancy Reagan's fierce protection of her husband led to her being portrayed as manipulative and controlling, a characterization that deeply wounded her. She consulted astrologers to help determine the president's schedule after the assassination attempt, a revelation that led to mockery, but which revealed the depth of her fear for his safety. Her devotion to Ronald Reagan was absolute, but it came at the cost of her own public image and relationships with her children. Presidents describe a profound loneliness that comes with the office. This isn't the solitude of physical isolation, but the psychological separation that comes from bearing ultimate responsibility. Harry Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki haunted him, though he publicly defended it. The knowledge that he had ordered the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, even in service of ending a war and potentially saving more lives, weighed on him in ways that few could understand. Lyndon Johnson, as the casualties in Vietnam mounted, would walk the White House halls late at night, checking casualty reports, unable to sleep. The burden of having sent young men to die wore on him visibly. Photographs from his final year in office show a man aged beyond his years. Johnson would sometimes break down in tears when discussing the war with advisors, the emotional toll overwhelming his famous political toughness. He became increasingly isolated, surrounded by advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, unable to escape the trap he had created for himself. The presidency strips away the possibility of genuine, unguarded human connection. Every conversation carries potential political implications. Every friendship faces scrutiny. Even family relationships become complicated by the demands of power. Franklin Roosevelt's children later revealed the emotional distance they felt from their father, who seemed always to be playing the role of president, even at family gatherings. FDR's charm was legendary, but it was a political tool as much as a personal quality, deployed strategically even with those closest to him. His marriage to Eleanor had evolved into a political partnership rather than a romantic relationship after his affair with Lucy Mercer, creating a household that functioned efficiently but lacked intimacy. Richard Nixon, perhaps more than any modern president, exemplified this isolation. His farewell speech to his staff, delivered the morning after his resignation, revealed the depths of his loneliness. He spoke of his mother as a saint and broke down in tears, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man whose entire political career had been built on rigid self-control. The tragedy of Nixon was that his desperate need for power stemmed partly from deep personal insecurity, yet achieving that power only intensified his isolation and paranoia. He trusted almost no one, recorded his conversations to protect himself, and created an atmosphere of suspicion that ultimately contributed to his downfall. The White House has witnessed countless moments where ideals collided with pragmatism, where noble intentions gave way to moral compromise. This isn't always dramatic corruption in the Watergate sense, but rather the subtle erosion of principles under the pressure of political necessity. Consider Woodrow Wilson, who campaigned in 1916 on the promise to keep America out of World War I, then led the nation into that conflict just months after his second inauguration. Wilson genuinely believed intervention had become necessary, but the reversal required him to deploy all the power of his office to manufacture consent. The Committee on Public Information, America's first true propaganda agency, churned out materials portraying the war in starkly moralistic terms. Dissent was criminalized through the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Wilson, who had been a professor of political science and believed in democratic deliberation, presided over the most severe restrictions on civil liberties in American history to that point. Socialist leader Eugene Debs was imprisoned for speaking against the war, and Wilson refused to pardon him even after the war ended. The idealistic professor who had promised a war to end all wars and make the world safe for democracy had become an authoritarian leader who tolerated no opposition. Franklin Roosevelt's decision to intern Japanese Americans during World War II represents another moral failure at the highest level of power. FDR approved Executive Order 9066, knowing that the vast majority of those affected were American citizens whose only crime was their ancestry. He was responding to war hysteria and political pressure, but he also understood the constitutional implications of his decision. The price of maintaining political support for the war effort was paid by 120,000 people who lost their homes, businesses, and freedom. Families were given days to dispose of property accumulated over lifetimes. They were sent to camps in remote desert locations, living in tar paper barracks behind barbed wire, guarded by soldiers with machine guns. FDR never publicly expressed Regret for this decision, though some advisors later claimed he had private doubts. The camps remained open until 1945, long after any reasonable threat of Japanese invasion had passed. It would take more than 4 decades for the government to formally apologize and provide reparations to survivors. The Iran-Contra affair during the Reagan administration reveals how compartmentalization of knowledge allows presidents to maintain plausible deniability while their subordinates commit illegal acts in pursuit of the administration's goals. Whether Reagan truly didn't know about the arms sales and illegal funding of Nicaraguan rebels, or whether he deliberately remained ignorant to protect himself, the result was the same. The White House had become a place where constitutional governance could be circumvented in the name of fighting communism. National Security Council staff operated a shadow foreign policy, selling weapons to Iran despite an arms embargo, and using the proceeds to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua despite congressional prohibitions. When the scheme was exposed, Reagan claimed he couldn't recall key meetings and decisions, a defense that worked legally but raised troubling questions about presidential accountability. The message was clear: if you don't officially know, you can't be held responsible, creating perverse incentives for presidents to remain ignorant of actions taken in their name. The White House has been both the subject and the architect of surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI maintained files on countless Americans, including presidents themselves. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson both feared Hoover's power, knowing he possessed information that could destroy their presidencies. This created a perverse dynamic where the elected president felt constrained by an unelected bureaucrat. Johnson reportedly said of Hoover, "I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in." Hoover had dirt on everyone, from civil rights leaders to members of Congress to presidents themselves. He used this information to maintain his position as FBI director for decades, immune from dismissal despite changing administrations. Presidents knew that challenging Hoover meant risking exposure of their own secrets or those of their political allies. But presidents also wielded surveillance as a weapon. Nixon's enemies list and the Watergate break-in are the most infamous examples, but they weren't aberrations. Multiple administrations used intelligence agencies to monitor political opponents, journalists, and civil rights leaders. The White House taping system that ultimately doomed Nixon had been used by previous presidents. Lyndon Johnson recorded his phone calls obsessively, accumulating thousands of hours of recordings that revealed his mastery of political persuasion and intimidation. Kennedy had recording equipment installed in the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room, though he used it more selectively than Sung. Johnson. These men wanted to control the historical narrative, but they also wanted leverage, information they could use if necessary. The tapes were insurance policies and tools of power, ways to remember who said what and to have proof if disputes arose. Nixon's mistake wasn't recording his conversations. It was getting caught and then fighting the release of tapes that proved his guilt. The post-9/11 expansion of surveillance powers represents the most dramatic extension of White House authority over American privacy. The Patriot Act, passed in the immediate aftermath of the attacks with little debate, dramatically expanded government surveillance capabilities. The NSA's warrantless wiretapping program, authorized by President Bush without congressional approval, allowed the government to monitor communications between Americans and foreign targets without obtaining warrants. When this program was exposed by whistleblowers and journalists, the Bush administration defended it as necessary to prevent future terrorist attacks. The legal justifications for drone strikes, which allowed the president to order the killing of American citizens abroad without trial, extended executive power in unprecedented ways. Presidents Bush and Obama, men of very different political philosophies, both defended these expansions of executive power as necessary to protect American lives. The price was paid in constitutional protections and civil liberties, a bargain that neither man seemed to lose sleep over, at least publicly. The surveillance state that emerged after 9/11 represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and citizens, one that concentrated enormous power in the executive branch with limited oversight or accountability. The health of the president has been one of the most closely guarded secrets in White House history. The American public has repeatedly elected leaders whose physical or mental conditions were far more serious than they knew. Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke in October 1919 that left him partially paralyzed and mentally impaired. For the final 17 months of his presidency, the true extent of Wilson's incapacity was hidden from Congress, the cabinet, and the American people. His wife, Edith Wilson, essentially functioned as a shadow president, deciding which documents her husband would see, which officials would be granted access. She would meet with advisors, review documents, and then claim to convey the president's wishes, though in many cases she was making the decisions herself. This was an unprecedented constitutional crisis that was largely covered up until long after Wilson left office. The vice president, Thomas Marshall, was kept in the dark about Wilson's condition and never assumed presidential duties. Cabinet members who tried to meet with the president were turned away. The government essentially operated without a functioning president for more than a year, a constitutional nightmare hidden behind closed doors. Franklin Roosevelt's declining health during his fourth term raises profound questions about transparency and leadership. By the time of the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt was a dying man, visibly frail, his cognitive abilities diminished. Yet this was hidden from the American people, who had just re-elected him. He died 2 months later. Would voters have chosen differently if they had known the truth? The decisions made at Yalta helped shape the post-war world and the Cold War. Was Roosevelt capable of negotiating effectively with Stalin and Churchill in his condition? Those who saw him at Yalta were shocked by his appearance. He had lost significant weight, his hands trembled, he struggled to focus during negotiations. Churchill's personal physician, Lord Morin, wrote in his diary that Roosevelt appeared to be a dying man. Yet the American press corps, following the conventions of the time, did not report on Roosevelt's obvious physical decline. The photographs from Yalta, when published, were carefully selected to minimize how ill he appeared. John F. Kennedy's medical history, hidden during his presidency, reveals a man who was far from the vigorous young leader he appeared. Kennedy suffered from Addison's disease and chronic back pain that required daily injections of steroids, painkillers, and amphetamines. He was receiving treatments from Dr. Max Jacobson, who would later lose his medical license for his questionable practices. Kennedy functioned as president while dependent on a cocktail of drugs that today would be considered disqualifying. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, Kennedy was managing the crisis while managing chronic pain and the effects of multiple medications. The steroids he took for Addison's disease could cause mood swings and impaired judgment. The amphetamines from Dr. Feelgood, as Jacobson was known, provided energy but could also cause paranoia and poor decision-making. That Kennedy successfully navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis despite these medical issues speaks to either his remarkable capabilities or remarkable luck, or both. Ronald Reagan's cognitive decline likely began during his second term, though the full extent didn't become public until after his presidency. Did Reagan's early Alzheimer's disease affect his decision-making during the Iran-Contra affair? His confused testimony certainly suggested cognitive problems. Yet again, the American public wasn't fully informed about the health of their leader. Reagan's inability to remember key meetings and decisions during the Iran-Contra investigation may have been a legal strategy, but it also reflected genuine cognitive impairment that was already beginning to manifest. The White House has developed sophisticated systems for managing information and shaping public perception. Press secretaries serve as buffers between the president and accountability. The careful staging of presidential appearances, the scripting of supposedly spontaneous remarks, the manipulation of imagery all serve to create a version of the presidency that may bear little resemblance to reality. The modern press operation employs dozens of people whose job is to shape the narrative, to provide favorable spin on events, and to limit damaging stories. Background briefings allow officials to plant stories while maintaining deniability. Off-the-record conversations let presidents and their staff influence coverage without leaving fingerprints. Photo opportunities are choreographed down to the smallest detail, with advanced teams ensuring perfect lighting and camera angles. Nothing is left to chance in the construction of the presidential image. The Johnson administration's credibility gap during Vietnam pioneered modern presidential deception. As the war went badly, the administration repeatedly misrepresented the situation to the American people. Body counts were inflated to show progress that didn't exist. Enemy capabilities were minimized to maintain public support. Progress was manufactured through creative statistics and misleading metrics. Johnson himself became trapped in the lies, unable to reverse course without admitting he had misled the nation. The price was paid in American and Vietnamese lives, and in the destruction of public trust in presidential honesty. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, revealed the systematic deception that had characterized American involvement in Vietnam across multiple administrations. The government had known for years that the war was unwinnable, but successive presidents had continued it anyway, unable to accept the political costs of withdrawal. The Bush administration's case for the Iraq War, built on claims about weapons of mass destruction that proved false, represents a more recent example. Whether the intelligence was deliberately manipulated or simply wrong, the result was that the American people were led into a war based on White House claims that couldn't be verified. Secretary of State Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations, complete with satellite photos and intelligence reports, was later shown to be based on flawed or fabricated intelligence. The aluminum tubes that were supposedly for nuclear centrifuges were for conventional rockets. The mobile biological weapons labs were for weather balloons. The yellowcake uranium from Niger was based on forged documents. Yet the administration had presented all of this as definitive proof of an imminent threat. The price continues to be paid in regional instability, American casualties, and the further erosion of trust in presidential statements about national security. Every president must function with the knowledge that their actions will be judged by history. This creates a unique psychological pressure. Private conversations may become public records. Decisions made in crisis will be analyzed for decades. Desire to shape one's legacy can become all-consuming. Lyndon Johnson was haunted by the fear that history would judge him a failure because of Vietnam, that his great society achievements would be forgotten. This fear drove some of his worst decisions, including his escalation of the war because he couldn't bear to be seen as the president who lost Vietnam. His presidential library, which he obsessively planned, was an attempt to control the historical narrative. The irony is that Johnson's fear of historical judgment helped create the very legacy he hoped to avoid. His domestic achievements in civil rights, education, healthcare, and poverty reduction were indeed overshadowed by Vietnam, precisely because he allowed that fear to drive his decisions. Richard Nixon's presidency was consumed by his consciousness of history. He recorded his conversations because he wanted to control how his presidency would be remembered. He saw himself as a major figure in world affairs, and he believed the tapes would vindicate his decisions. Instead, they destroyed him. The 18-and-a-half-minute gap in a crucial tape became a symbol of his guilt. Nixon's awareness of history, rather than elevating his conduct, encouraged his worst instincts toward secrecy and control. He was so concerned with how future generations would view him that he made decisions designed to protect his image rather than do what was right. The result was a legacy of dishonor that no amount of foreign policy achievement could overcome. Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky and the subsequent impeachment demonstrate how personal failings become historical judgment. Clinton, a president who by many measures had been successful in office, saw his legacy defined by a sex scandal. His attempts to parse the meaning of words during his testimony became emblems of dishonesty. The price of his personal conduct was paid in historical standing and in the brutal public exposure of private behavior. The Starr report, which detailed the affair in graphic terms, was published on the internet for anyone to read. Clinton's daughter had to endure knowing that people around the world could read explicit details about her father's sexual behavior. The national trauma of the impeachment, which consumed Washington for more than a year, represented a massive waste of political capital and national attention during a time of relative peace and prosperity. Leaving the White House doesn't end the price of power, it merely transforms it. Former presidents face the challenge of constructing a post-presidential life while carrying the weight of their decisions in office. Jimmy Carter found redemption through humanitarian work, building homes for the poor and monitoring elections worldwide. His post-presidency rehabilitated a reputation damaged by his perceived failures in office. Yet Carter also carried the burden of the Iran hostage crisis, a trauma that haunted him. His inability to secure the hostages, released before leaving office, remained a wound that subsequent achievements couldn't entirely heal. The failed rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, in which 8 American servicemen died in the Iranian desert, represented a humiliation that Carter felt personally responsible for. George W. Bush retreated into relative privacy after leaving office, taking up painting and avoiding public political commentary for years. His silence spoke to the weight of Iraq and the financial crisis. Bush's paintings of wounded warriors suggest a man grappling with the human cost of his decisions. Unlike some predecessors, he seemed to recognize that defending his legacy would only reopen wounds. Barack Obama, as the first black president, carried unique burdens into his post-presidency. The hope he represented to many and the backlash he faced from others created pressures that extended beyond policy. His successor's systematic efforts to dismantle his legacy added another layer of price to his service. Obama's visible aging during his 8 years in office reflected the toll that the presidency exacts. His hair turned gray, lines deepened in his face, the weight of the office visible in every photograph. The modern presidency has become more demanding, more scrutinized, and more consuming than ever before. The 24-hour news cycle, social media, and the polarization of American politics have intensified every pressure that previous presidents faced. The presidency now requires a candidate to endure a campaign process that can last years, raising hundreds of millions of dollars, submitting to endless public appearances and debates, and allowing their entire life history to be investigated and publicized. The personal cost of running for president has become so steep that many qualified potential candidates decline to enter the race. The price is paid before the first oath of office is even taken. Once in office, modern presidents face instant analysis of every word and action. A casual comment can trigger an international incident. A policy proposal faces immediate fact-checking and opposition research. The president's family members become targets for political attacks. The stress has become so intense that presidential aging is visible, with before and after photos showing dramatic transformation over just 4 or 8 years. The polarization of American politics means that roughly half the country will view any president as illegitimate or dangerous. This isn't entirely new, but the intensity and the ecosystem of partisan media amplify it. Presidents now govern knowing that approximately half of Americans will oppose anything they propose, regardless of merit. Building consensus has become nearly impossible. The price is paid in policy paralysis and national division. The White House has become a permanent crisis management center. The assumption that the president can and should respond to every disaster, every international event, every economic fluctuation creates unsustainable demands. Presidents are expected to be simultaneously commander-in-chief, economist-in-chief, consoler-in-chief, and celebrity-in-chief. This expansion of expectations means that presidential failure is virtually guaranteed. No one person can meet all the demands placed on the office. Every president leaves office with significant unfulfilled promises and unresolved crises. The price of this impossibility is paid in public cynicism and in the personal toll on those who occupy the office. The use of executive orders and executive actions has expanded because presidents, unable to work with Congress, try to govern through unilateral action. This further concentrates power in the White House, while making policy more volatile, since each new president can reverse their predecessor's orders. The result is an imperial presidency that the founders would barely recognize, one that carries immense power but also immense burdens. Beyond the formal powers outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution, the presidency operates according to unwritten rules and norms that have developed over 2 centuries. These norms carry no legal weight, but their violation exacts a political price. The peaceful transfer of power, while not mandated by law, has been an essential norm of American democracy. The willingness of defeated candidates to concede and outgoing presidents to facilitate the transition represents a recognition that the office is larger than any individual. When this norm is challenged, the price is paid in democratic legitimacy and national unity. The expectation that presidents will not profit from the office, will divest from conflicting business interests, and will maintain a basic separation between personal finances and official duties has been another crucial norm. While presidents have always had wealth and business interests, there has traditionally been an effort to minimize conflicts. The erosion of this norm creates the appearance, if not the reality, of corruption. There may be a limit to how much power a democratic society can invest in a single office before the price becomes unsustainable. The modern presidency concentrates power in ways that would have alarmed the founders. The president commands the world's most powerful military, controls a vast intelligence apparatus, can target individuals for assassination, influences the economy through regulatory power, and shapes public discourse through their prominence. This concentration of power creates multiple dangers. It attracts individuals who seek power for its own sake. It enables abuses that are difficult to check. It creates unrealistic expectations that lead to disappointment and cynicism. It places impossible burdens on whoever holds the office. And it makes a single election outcome matter so much that losing becomes existential for both parties. At the center of all this analysis of power and its costs are human beings. Every president has been a choice, person with strengths and flaws, hopes and fears, moments of courage and moments of weakness. The office demands superhuman abilities but is always occupied by humans. Some presidents rose to meet extraordinary challenges. Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union through the Civil War while carrying the burden of hundreds of thousands of deaths, the weight of which contributed to his visible depression. Franklin Roosevelt led the nation through the Great Depression and World War II despite being unable to walk, hiding his disability because he feared appearing weak. Both men paid enormous personal prices but achieved historic accomplishments. Other presidents failed under the pressure. James Buchanan's indecisiveness as the nation drifted toward civil war stemmed partly from his awareness that any action he took would be momentous, and he froze. Herbert Hoover, a capable administrator, was psychologically unsuited to provide the leadership needed during the Depression, unable to adapt his philosophy to the crisis. The price of their failures was paid by the nation. Most presidents fall somewhere in between, achieving some successes and suffering some failures, their legacies mixed. They make decisions with imperfect information under enormous pressure, often choosing between bad options and worse ones. They sacrifice their privacy, their health, and their family life. They age visibly under the strain. And when they leave office, they carry with them the consequences of their decisions, good and bad. This brings us to the central question. Is the price worth paying? Does the power of the presidency justify the costs it imposes on those who seek it and hold it? There's no easy answer. The presidency has enabled great achievements. It has also enabled great harms. The same concentration of power that allows for decisive action in crisis also creates the possibility of abuse. The same prominence that gives the president a platform for leadership also creates unrealistic expectations and intense scrutiny. What is clear is that anyone seeking the presidency should do so with eyes open to the true price. It is not merely a job or even just a responsibility. It is a consuming burden that will affect every aspect of their life and the lives of those they love. It will require moral compromises, personal sacrifices, and the acceptance of being judged by history. It will isolate them even as it makes them the center of attention. And when they leave office, they will carry the weight of their decisions for the rest of their lives. The White House stands as a symbol of American democracy, but it is also a monument to the price of power. Its elegant rooms have witnessed triumph and tragedy, nobility and corruption, sacrifice and selfishness. The history of the presidency is ultimately a very human story of people grappling with power that is both necessary and dangerous. The White House will endure. Future presidents will take the oath of office, move into the residence, and begin their own confrontations with power. They will make the same essential bargain that every president has made, accepting the burdens of the office in exchange for the opportunity to shape history. The secret history of the White House reveals that this bargain is far more costly than most people realize. It exacts a price not just in time and energy, but in health, relationships, privacy, and moral complexity. No president leaves office unchanged by the experience. All carry scars, visible and invisible. Yet despite knowing this price, people continue to seek the presidency. This speaks to something fundamental in human nature, the desire to matter, to make a difference, to leave a mark on history. Whether this ambition is noble or dangerous depends on the character of the individual and the circumstances of the time. The challenge for American democracy is to ensure that the price of presidential power is paid by those who seek it, not by the democratic institutions and norms that constrain it. The presidency must be powerful enough to meet genuine crises but constrained enough to prevent tyranny. This balance has never been easy to maintain and may be harder now than ever before. As we look at the White House, gleaming white on its hill, we should remember the human drama that unfolds within. We should remember the families who have lived there, the decisions made there, the prices paid there. We should remember that the presidency is occupied by people with all the flaws and virtues that entails. And we should ask ourselves what kind of person we want to entrust with that power, knowing the price it will exact from them and potentially from us all. The secret history of the White House is ultimately not about scandals or conspiracies, though those exist. It is about the fundamental truth that power, even democratic power exercised with good intentions, carries costs that are often hidden, but always real. Understanding those costs is essential to being an informed citizen in a democracy. The bargain continues, the price will be paid. The question is whether we are paying attention to what that price truly means for our leaders and for our nation. The White House keeps its secrets, but its history speaks loud and clear to those willing to listen. Power is never free. Someone always pays the price.